Rosetta, I didn't get to say hello to you yet, so hello. And it is good to see you again, and I felt like I was hearing almost a broken record. I've learned so much. I've grown and changed. My life has changed. I think I heard that from Austin a couple years ago, and so we're just grateful. I want to thank Janet. I think you put the little display up here. Thank you. It's just that word grace is kind of prominent in that display, and yet it's so simple. And just kind of made an impact on me this morning as I saw that, and the flowers and the little light. Grace of God. Grace of God for Rosie and her life at VitaNet and others. And you know, each of us experience the grace of God and probably don't even recognize it. So I just want to acknowledge God's grace in bringing us here this morning, that we can share together, that we can fellowship, and that we can study a little bit too. As I look at this passage, it draws out so many questions. There's several questions that are actually printed right in the text, but there's other questions that come along as we read it and study. Do you ever wish you could have been sitting in on one of the teaching sessions led by Jesus? Now, I'm not sure that Jesus often established formal sessions where he invited people to come and sit down with him while he taught. But I do know that Jesus did make intentional efforts to connect with people by using parables and stories so that people could understand things that they grasped, things that they understood, and he would use those illustrations to help in his teaching times. It's interesting, about halfway through this passage that Delbert read for us, Peter raised a question. And I think that question could have been on my mind as well, if I would have been sitting in that session that day. Peter wanted to know if Jesus was specifically talking to him and the rest of the disciples, or if this lesson he was trying to share with them that day was for the rest of the people who happened to be there. And in typical Jesus-like fashion, he didn't answer Peter's question directly. He probably did that so that Peter would stay attentive, that Peter would stay with him and follow along. Something in what Jesus said kept Peter wondering. And so hopefully as we look through this passage, you will continue to wonder. You'll continue to ask the questions that you need to know. As Jesus described what servants should be doing, he said it will be good for servants to be found by their master watching and ready. So are we watching? Are we ready? Are we even serving during those times of being watching, or as we're preparing, as we're trying to get ready? Are we serving? At the start of this story, Jesus told his listeners to be ready for service and to keep their lamps burning. And then to further illustrate and make it practical, he said it would be like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet. Have you ever waited for someone to come back and you're not sure exactly when they'll come? If these servants were ready and they're waiting for his return, that meant that they would be able to respond immediately, to open the door for their master when he came back. Now, I think it would be helpful for us to understand what this means if we compare verse 35 in several translations. So let me just put that up on the screen for you. Verse 35 is, I have it in like four translations for you. NIV is what we read earlier. Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning. Now the next one, King James, is a little bit more challenging for some who didn't grow up with that language. Let your loins be girded about and let your lights burning. The lights and lamps part kind of keeps consistent, but that loins girded part is kind of tough to get. Be dressed in readiness. Be dressed for service. To be ready means to have your belt fastened around your waist. How many of you have a belt on? Some of you do, some don't. But it means have that belt put around your waist. In those days, people wore robes. That was the dress of the day. And in order to be ready, the outer portion of that robe would be pulled up or gathered together in some way and tucked into their belt, tucked into a sash. And then they would be able to run, to travel, to fight, or to work. So when they were called upon to do something, they were ready. If they had that belt tightened up, if they have their robe tucked up a little bit, then they could move. They would be prepared to do whatever was asked of them. They were ready. In Luke chapter 9, just back a couple chapters, some people were with Jesus. And one man said, I will follow you wherever you go and do whatever you ask. That sounds like someone who's ready, who's prepared. They want to go. And then in that verse it says, but. He said, but first, let me go back and say goodbye to my family. Jesus could have said, but I thought you said you're ready. You're prepared. Well, I am, but, well, then are you ready? Another one said, I would follow you anywhere, Jesus. But first, let me go bury my father. They were ready, but not ready. Now there's, a time to bury someone who's died. So that's legitimate. But I'm not sure this person had even died yet. They were delaying wanting to follow fully what Jesus asked them to do. Well, in this story that Jesus was telling, they were told to be ready, and that meant that the servants were watching for their master's return, regardless of what time it would be. And in the passage it says it could have been during the night, during the second or third watch. Those were in the latter part of the night. It's still dark. That would be the reason to have lamps lit. He also went on to say that a homeowner would not allow a thief to break into his house if he knew the thief was coming. Now, you don't want to allow him to break in at any time, but if you know when the guy's coming, you're going to take precautions. You're going to be prepared. You're going to stop that person if at all possible. Now, this doesn't mean that a thief is going to come to every single house at some point in time. But the key to remember is that the master was going to return. And he says it's just like the Son of Man. The Son of Man is going to return, even though you do not know when it will happen. Be prepared. Be ready for the return. Be ready for the master's return. I was talking to a man this week about the different ways that some employees approach their work. Some of them arrive and they're ready to get to work right away. They're ready to receive their instructions. They're waiting for the plan of what's going to happen that day. They're prepared. They arrive ready to get to work. But he also mentioned there's others that have developed a pattern of coming and sitting in the break room. They want to drink coffee for a while. And they're in no hurry to get going. Now that's not an indictment on those of you who drink coffee. But in that setting, that's what was happening. They'd arrive, they'd sit down a while, they'd drink their coffee. There's no sense of urgency to get to work. And when the boss steps into the room, suddenly they scurry off to look like they're busy and get doing something. And in reality, they were not ready. They were not even desiring to begin working. So the servants in this passage needed to wait. They needed to watch, even though they did not know when their master was going to return. These things were all part of what it meant to be ready. Get your loins girded about. Get the belt tightened up. Be prepared. Be watching. Be observant. Part of the task of the servant was to watch for the master, to serve the master, to do what the master called them to do. I was looking at this and I'm thinking, well, what's wrong with the master? Can't he open the door himself? Well, he probably could. But for this illustration, the master is to be served by the servants. Do what he needs them to do. Be prepared. Be ready. The focus for most of this story so far has been on being faithful servants, being faithful workers. But you may have also noticed that twice, and then a latter time again, another time later, in this first section, Jesus mentions that it would be good for those servants to be found by their master and to be found ready, to be found prepared, to be watching, and that their master would observe them in that kind of a position of being ready, in a watchful attitude. To be found ready and watching meant that the servants were faithfully doing what they had been instructed or asked to do. However, on this occasion, the master who found the servants being faithful invited the servants to attend some kind of a special recognition or a banquet. And instead of the servants serving the master, it was turned around the other way. The master put on the servants' clothes, and the master served these faithful servants. He honored these servants. They were blessed by their master. Peter heard all of these things that Jesus was saying, and the wheels are turning in his mind. Peter is also the one, if we look back in Matthew chapter 19, verse 22, who asked a question after a rich man who had been in the conversation with Jesus left, and he was sad. Jesus had been talking about how difficult it is to enter the kingdom of heaven, and especially difficult for one who has plenty of things, who's rich and is holding on to those things. It's so difficult for one like that to enter the kingdom of heaven. And so Peter asks, what would be for them? Referring to the disciples. What would be for them? What would they be expecting to receive since they had left everything to follow Jesus? That's this same Peter who is now asking, is this story that you're telling right now, Jesus, is this meant for us? Or is this meant for the rest of the people? Peter may have been asking internally, was he in? Was he one of the ones Jesus is talking about who this would be good for? Remember, he said it would be good for these servants to be found by their master, ready and watching. And so Peter might have been thinking, am I one of those? Would he be the one who would receive the blessing from the master? Now, asking questions is a good thing. It's not considered a bad thing unless the only thing you have in mind is what's in this for me. And I don't know, is that Peter's motive? What's in this for me, Jesus? Is this story for me? Because I want to know what I'm going to receive. He might have had other things going on in his mind too. But Jesus pressed on with a bit more focus on being faithful by asking those in the crowd. In verse 42 he says, "Who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time?" And one more time he says it would be good for that servant to be found doing that. So this servant must have been in charge of making sure the others are well fed at the proper times of the day. And he says that servant, it would do him well if he would be found carrying out those instructions, exactly what he's supposed to do. And as a result of doing that, he would or could expect to receive the entrustment of more responsibility, even to the point of being asked to oversee all of the possessions that his master had. And then Jesus lays out another scenario, which is kind of peculiar if you think about it. This servant recognizes that his master has not returned. It's taking a long time for him to come back. And all of a sudden he just begins to beat the other servants. Probably the one that he has responsibility over. The ones that he might have to make sure they have enough to eat. He beats on them. And he begins to spend his time eating and drinking and becoming drunk. I think this behavior would be a complete misuse of the power and the authority that had been given to him by the master. Just kind of an out-of-the-blue story. Why are you telling this, Jesus? You're encouraging this servant to be found faithful, doing what he's supposed to do, and then you bring this other scenario where possibly he thinks about the master's taking so long, and then he begins to take advantage of these other servants. But I think he uses that to drive home the next point. At some unexpected time, as this servant is experiencing all the pleasure he wants, not paying attention to what he's supposed to do, at some unexpected time, the master does return. And the master finds him not being faithful. He finds him not being ready or watching or doing what he's supposed to do. And it says the punishment for this servant was great. Verse 47 and 48 complete this passage with two additional situations. One of the servants is identified who knew what the will of or the desire and expectations of the master, what they were. He knew what those things are, and he chooses to ignore them, to disregard them. Does a different set of work. And we read that the punishment and the consequences were very severe for that servant. And then he says there's another servant who was not fully aware of all the expectations that the master had of him, and yet he did some things that were out of line, and this one too received punishment, not nearly as severe as the other one. As the one who chose to disregard everything he knew about the master's wishes. Both of these servants were held accountable for what they had been given, what they were expected to do. They were both held accountable. And he says, those who are entrusted with much, much will be expected of them. When you bring all these things together, this discussion, this interaction with different types of servants, the main takeaway from this story, I believe, is that the master is going to return. Our master is going to return. And so we must live expecting that Jesus is going to come back. If we live expecting Jesus to return, it should encourage us to be found faithful. To also know that faithfulness is going to be rewarded. There are rewards. There are ways that we're held accountable. But the main point is that the master is going to return. Let me read you one quote from a Bible, from the Moody Bible commentary. The point of this parable is not to provide the hearer with a catalog of rewards and punishments, or to draw conclusions about the relationship of the slaves to master or disciples to Jesus, but to simply encourage faithfulness. Sometimes we read these stories and we start making lists of this is okay to do, this is not. That's not what he's saying. He's not trying to make a list of things. He's just saying, I want you to be faithful. I want to go back to this question that Peter raised in the middle of the story. Is this parable for me or is it for others? And I think if Jesus would have answered directly, he would have said yes. It's for both for you, Peter, and it's for others too. As I think about this passage, it caused me to think about my life right now. The last 8 months have been some of the most challenging times for our family as some adjustments have been made. The new reality of working and doing pastoral ministry in a less than full-time way has been a difficult thing to adjust to. Scrambling from one part-time job to another has been taxing in a lot of ways. And yet I'm challenged to think about how much I have been given and what is expected of me. And I'm thinking more in terms of what God has done, what He's given me, not so much what you've asked me to do, but what has God asked me to do and what's expected of me. This story from Luke 12 has pushed the question of being faithful to front and center for me. So I'm asking this question or a number of questions of myself. How am I being faithful with the time I have? Whether it's pastoral ministry or other work I'm doing, how am I able to be faithful with my time? Am I faithful with what I'm able to do? Am I trusting God to supply what I need? Both material things and just strength and thinking capacities. And I think it's important for us to ask those same kind of questions of ourselves as a church family. Are we being faithful with what God has given us to do? Are we being faithful with how we relate to each other and how we fellowship with each other and support each other? As I consider what I need to do to be ready, to be faithful, this word wait or waiting is often part of the process of being prepared. The word wait from this passage means to wait with confidence or patience. And sometimes those two overlap and go together. Confidently waiting, patiently waiting. As a servant who desires to be ready and prepared, I need to be confident. I need to be patient that Jesus is not only with me, but that He will return. Serving faithfully, even though no one is watching, or the task is not one of my favorites, is still important. How faithful have I been? I'm a follower of Jesus, and I am expected to do my best with what I have been entrusted. Maybe the story was just pressing in on Peter a little too hard. And he's trying to look for a way to wiggle out of it, of what he's supposed to learn. Jesus, is that really for me? Talk a little more directly to the other people now, Jesus. And so Jesus didn't answer his question. Probably the way Peter expected. But I believe toward the end of this time of listening, Peter was understanding that main point of faithful. Be faithful. Be faithful. Let's pray. God, each of us have been given the same amount of time or hours of each day. 24 hours. 60 minutes in each hour. We have decisions to make regarding how we will use each of those minutes. God, I admit sometimes I have not used that time as well as I could have. And God, if that has been a reflection onto who you are to others, I'm sorry. Forgive me. I thank you for the questions that this passage raises in my mind. And I ask you, O God, to keep examining us. Keep the flame of persistence in our hearts. Help us to examine how you have been faithful to us, the promise that you will return. And I ask, O God, that would ignite us into renewed faithfulness. Help us to be ready. Help us to be watching, and in that process to be serving, to represent you well in this world. God, I'm aware of the troubling times we live in, even in our own community, things that take place that we thought only happen in other cities and other places. The distrust and anger and hate that people are voicing are something we have not experienced, many of us have not experienced in the past. And so I ask you to give us wisdom to be faithful in those times. Help us to lean on your strength. Guide us in the path of righteousness so that we can give you honor and glory. I pray for renewed strength for each person in this room. Help us to receive your love and your grace and allow that to motivate us every single morning, throughout the day, into the evening, even as we sleep. You're good. You're gracious. And I praise you for that. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.